I turned 70 that day. The cake was ready. The candles were lit. And not a single member of my family showed up. At 9:47 that night, a stranger knocked on my door and said something that changed everything. "Mrs. Wilson," he said quietly, "I've been looking for you for 22 years. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches." For most of my life, birthdays had never been about gifts. They were about family, about hearing laughter fill the house, about watching grandchildren fight over the biggest slice of cake, about sitting around a table and realizing that all the sacrifices, all the years, had meant something. That was what I believed, at least until my 70th birthday. I started preparing 3 weeks in advance. The dining room looked beautiful. I polished my late husband's oak table until it gleamed beneath the chandelier. I bought fresh flowers from a small florist downtown. White lilies, Richard's favorite. My husband had been gone for almost 8 years. Sometimes I still caught myself reaching for the phone to tell him something. Sometimes I still expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway. Grief changes shape over time. It never truly leaves. I arranged 8 place settings. 1 for me, 1 for my son Jason, 1 for my daughter-in-law Melissa, 3 for my grandchildren, 2 for my sister and her husband. Each name card was handwritten. Each chair represented someone I loved, someone I thought loved me. The cake sat in the center of the table. 3 layers, vanilla and strawberry. My granddaughter Sophie used to beg me to make it every birthday. "Grandma's magic cake," she called it. I smiled when I remembered that. Back then, she used to run into my arms whenever she saw me. Now she was 16, and I hadn't seen her in almost 4 months. Still, I told myself everyone was busy. Families grow. Schedules become complicated. That's normal. At 6 o'clock sharp, I lit the candles. The small flames flickered softly against the dining room walls. I checked my phone. Nothing. No messages. No calls. No explanations. At 6:15, I reassured myself. Traffic. Someone was running late. At 6:30, I reheated the food. At 6:45, I checked the driveway. Still empty. The silence inside the house began to feel different. Not peaceful. Not calm. Heavy. Like something waiting to happen. At 7 o'clock, I called Jason. Straight to voicemail. I waited 5 minutes and called again. Voicemail. Then Melissa. No answer. My sister. No answer. I stood alone in the dining room staring at 8 untouched plates. The roast was getting cold. The candles were burning lower. And for the first time all evening, a thought slipped into my mind. What if nobody was coming? I immediately pushed the thought away. No, not Jason. Not my family. Not today. At 7:30, my phone buzzed. Relief flooded through me. Finally, a message from my son. I opened it. My smile disappeared. "Sorry, Mom. Something came up. We'll talk later." That was it. No explanation. No apology. No mention of my birthday. Just 12 words. I read them 3 times. Then a 4th. As if somehow they would change. As if another sentence would magically appear. It didn't. The dining room suddenly felt enormous. I sat down slowly. Across from me sat 7 empty chairs. 7 silent reminders. At 8 o'clock, I blew out the candles myself. No birthday song. No grandchildren laughing. No family photographs. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest. I carried the cake into the kitchen. My hands felt strangely numb. As I set it down, my phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a social media notification. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I opened the app. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was Melissa, smiling, holding a glass of wine. Beside her stood Jason. My grandchildren were there too. Everyone looked happy. Very happy. The caption read, "Family night with the people who matter most." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I scrolled. Another photo. And another. And another. A private dining room at an expensive restaurant downtown. Everyone was there. My sister. My brother-in-law. My son. My grandchildren. Even relatives who lived over an hour away. Every single person invited to my birthday. Every single one. Except me. I stared at the screen. The realization arrived slowly. Then all at once. This wasn't an accident. Nobody forgot. Nobody got stuck in traffic. Nobody had an emergency. They had made plans. Plans that included everyone. Except the 70-year-old woman sitting alone beside an untouched birthday cake. My cheeks burned. Not from anger. From humiliation. I thought about the empty chairs. The flowers. The food. The hours spent preparing. I thought about how excited I'd been that morning, how carefully I'd done my hair, how long I'd stood in front of the mirror deciding which dress to wear. I suddenly felt foolish, old, embarrassingly hopeful. I set my phone face down. The house felt colder now. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the windows. I turned off the dining room lights. One by one, the room disappeared into darkness. I was halfway up the stairs when someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Firm, deliberate. Not the hurried knock of a delivery driver. Not the cheerful knock of family. I froze. My heart started pounding. At nearly 10 o'clock, nobody visited unexpectedly, especially not in the rain. The knocking came again. I walked toward the door. Carefully. The porch light revealed a tall man standing beneath the storm. Gray hair, dark overcoat, weathered face, a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. I had never seen him before. Not once. When I opened the door, he looked directly at me. His eyes widened slightly, as if he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. Then he spoke. Mrs. Margaret Wilson? Yes. He exhaled slowly. The rain dripped from his coat. And then he said the words that would change my life forever. I've been looking for you for 22 years. And suddenly, my forgotten birthday was no longer the biggest mystery of the night. I stared at the man on my porch. Rain fell steadily behind him. The porch light cast long shadows across his face, making him look older than he probably was. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. All I could hear was the rain, and my own heartbeat. I've been looking for you for 22 years. The sentence replayed in my mind. 22 years. That wasn't a random number. That was specific, deliberate, important. I'm sorry, I finally said. Do I know you? The man shook his head. No, ma'am. His voice was calm, respectful, very different from the way most people spoke these days, especially family. My name is Daniel Brooks. The name meant nothing to me. I searched my memory. Neighbors, former co-workers, church members, friends of Richard's. Nothing. I don't believe we've met. We haven't. He hesitated, almost as I didn't sleep much that night. After Daniel left, I sat alone in the kitchen with Richard's letter in front of me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes old memories louder. I must have read the first page 10 times. Each time, the same sentence pulled at me. If you're reading this, they finally showed their true faces. At first, I wanted to believe Richard had been mistaken. People change. Families go through difficult periods. Misunderstandings happen. That was what I told myself. It was what I had been telling myself for years. But as the night stretched into morning, something uncomfortable began happening. Memories started resurfacing. Not dramatic memories. Not obvious betrayals. Small things. Tiny moments I had ignored. Tiny moments that suddenly looked very different. I made a cup of coffee around 4 in the morning and sat by the kitchen window. The rain had stopped. The neighborhood was still asleep. And one by one, the puzzle pieces began clicking into place. The first memory that came back was Sophie's 12th birthday. I had spent weeks shopping for her gift. A silver bracelet she'd wanted for months. Melissa called me the night before. Oh, Margaret, there's been a change of plans. Her voice had sounded sweet, almost apologetic. The party had to be moved. I remembered being disappointed, but I hadn't argued. Families get busy. Things happen. The next day I called Sophie to wish her a happy birthday. She sounded confused. Grandma, where were you? I still remember the silence that followed. What do you mean, sweetheart? The party was today. At the time, Melissa laughed it off. A simple misunderstanding. An innocent mistake. I believed her. Now I wasn't so sure. I stared into my coffee. Cold realization settled in my chest. That wasn't the only incident. Not even close. A second memory surfaced. Christmas, 3 years ago. Jason called me 2 days before dinner. Mom, we're keeping it really small this year. I remember smiling, trying not to sound hurt. Of course, honey. I spent Christmas Day alone. Just me and an old movie playing in the background. The following week, my sister accidentally mentioned how crowded Jason's house had been. More than 20 guests. Neighbors. Friends. Cousins. Everyone had been invited. Everyone except me. Back then, I convinced myself there had been a misunderstanding. Now I wasn't sure anymore. I looked toward the dining room. The birthday decorations were still there. The flowers. The empty chairs. The untouched streamers hanging from the walls. Suddenly, they felt connected to every other disappointment. Every canceled invitation. Every forgotten holiday. Every awkward excuse. I wasn't looking at one bad birthday. I was looking at years of exclusion. Years. Around 7 o'clock that morning, my phone buzzed. For a brief moment, my heart lifted. Maybe Jason finally wanted to explain. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he realized what he'd done. I opened the message. It was from Melissa. Just 2 sentences. Hope you're feeling better. We'll stop by sometime this week. That was it. No mention of my birthday. No apology. No acknowledgement. Nothing. I stared at the screen. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. My 70th birthday had come and gone. My entire family had abandoned me. And somehow Melissa was acting as though nothing had happened. As though I had simply caught a cold. I set the phone down. For the first time, anger began replacing hurt. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that comes after years of swallowing disappointment. Around noon, Daniel returned. He carried another folder. This one looked older than the first. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Richard and I had shared breakfast for nearly 40 years. Daniel studied me carefully. You didn't sleep. It wasn't a question. No. He nodded. Neither did Richard the night he gave me that letter. That caught my attention immediately. I looked up. What do you mean? Daniel rested both hands on the folder. Your husband knew more than you realize. A chill ran through me. What exactly did he know? Daniel hesitated. For the first time, he seemed uncomfortable, as though he was deciding how much to say. Finally, he opened the folder. Inside were copies of old documents. Notes. Records. Dates. Most of it meant nothing to me at first. Then I noticed a familiar name. Melissa. My stomach tightened. Daniel tapped one of the pages. Margaret, your husband started keeping records about 6 years before he died. I felt my pulse quicken. Records of what? Daniel looked directly into my eyes. The times your family excluded you. The room suddenly felt smaller. Warmer. Harder to breathe in. I stared at him. Certain I had misunderstood. Richard had been tracking it? Writing it down? For years? Daniel slowly slid a document across the table. At the top was Richard's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The same handwriting from birthday cards. Anniversary notes. Love letters. My fingers trembled as I read the first line. Melissa has isolated Margaret from another family event. I looked up, unable to speak. Daniel's expression remained calm, but his next words hit even harder. That was only the beginning. Then he opened the folder to reveal dozens more pages. And for the first time, I realized my husband hadn't been paranoid. He had been preparing for something. Something he believed would eventually happen. Something much bigger than a forgotten birthday. I sat there for a long time after Daniel opened the folder. The pages were spread across my kitchen table. Some were notes. Some were dates. Some were observations written in Richard's familiar handwriting. Every page felt like a conversation with a man I thought I already knew. But the more I read, the more I realized there were things Richard had carried alone. Things he had never fully shared with me. Not because he didn't trust me. Because he was trying to protect me. I picked up one of the pages. The date at the top was nearly 7 years old. Richard had written only 3 short sentences. Melissa changed the Thanksgiving location. Margaret was informed after everyone arrived. Margaret pretended not to be hurt. I stared at those words. I remembered that Thanksgiving. At the time, Jason had called me an hour before dinner. We moved everything to Melissa's cousin's house. I had laughed, pretended it didn't matter. Then I drove 45 minutes across town carrying 2 homemade pies. When I arrived, everyone was already eating. Nobody looked surprised to see me late. As if they had expected it. As if I was always the last person to know. Back then, I blamed poor communication. Now I wasn't so sure. Daniel remained quiet while I read. He seemed to understand that some discoveries needed silence. Eventually, I looked up. Why didn't Richard tell me all of this? Daniel folded his hands. He tried. I frowned. What do you mean? Daniel pointed to another page. You remember your anniversary trip to Charleston? Of course I remembered. It had been one of the last vacations Richard and I ever took together. A beautiful week near the water. Long walks. Fresh seafood. Quiet mornings. It had felt like a second honeymoon. I nodded. Daniel gave a small smile. That's when he first became worried. The words caught me off guard. Worried about what? You. I looked back down at the papers. Confused. Richard had never acted worried during that trip. Not once. In fact, he had seemed happier than usual. Daniel slowly reached into the folder and removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. My name was written across the front. Margaret. Just that. Nothing else. I immediately recognized the handwriting. Richard's. My chest tightened. What's this? He asked me to keep it. Daniel's voice was careful. He wasn't sure you'd ever need to read it. I turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Holding it felt strangely intimate, as though Richard was standing beside me, waiting, watching. I finally slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter, much shorter than the first one, only a single page, but every word felt heavy. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, it means my concerns were justified. Please understand something before you continue. None of this is your fault. Your kindness has always been your greatest strength. Unfortunately, it has also made you vulnerable. I stopped reading. My vision blurred slightly. Not from tears. From recognition. Richard knew me better than anyone. He always had. I continued. For years, you have given people the benefit of the doubt. You believe explanations. You forgive easily. You assume the best. I love that about you. But I have seen things you refuse to see. Melissa does not merely dislike you. She wants influence over everyone around her. And Jason has become easier to influence than he realizes. I lowered the page. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. I remembered countless conversations over the years. Little comments from Richard. Questions that seemed harmless. Observations I dismissed. Now they returned with uncomfortable clarity. One evening, years ago, he had asked me something while we were washing dishes. Do you ever feel like Melissa wants control over every family gathering? I laughed. She's just organized. Richard hadn't argued. He simply nodded. Another time he asked why Melissa always volunteered to handle invitations. Again, I dismissed it. I defended her. I defended everyone. That was what mothers do. At least that's what I thought. The truth was harder. Sometimes mothers defend people because they don't want to face reality. Daniel waited patiently while I finished reading. When I reached the final paragraph, my hands began trembling. If the day ever comes when they isolate you completely, trust the evidence, not the excuses. Everything you need has already been prepared. You are stronger than you know. And you are not alone. Love always. Richard. The room fell silent. I read those last 3 words several times. You are not alone. For months after Richard died, that had been my greatest fear. Being alone. Not physically. Emotionally. Watching the world move forward without him. Watching family drift away. Watching traditions disappear. Yet, somehow, years before his death, he had anticipated all of it. I carefully folded the letter. Daniel finally spoke. Richard loved you very much. I smiled sadly. I know. No, Daniel said quietly. I don't think you understand. Something in his voice made me look up. For the first time all afternoon, Daniel seemed genuinely troubled, as though he had been debating whether to say something. What is it? I asked. He hesitated. Then he reached toward the folder again. There is something else Richard left behind. My pulse quickened. Another letter? Another set of notes? I wasn't sure I was ready for more. Daniel pulled out a thin document. Unlike the others, this one looked official. Legal. The moment I saw Richard's signature at the bottom, my stomach tightened. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a personal letter. It was a decision. A deliberate one. And judging by Daniel's expression, it was a decision capable of changing everything I thought I knew about my family. Margaret, he said softly, I think it's time you learned about the second document. And in that moment, I realized the letters were only the beginning. For several seconds, neither Daniel nor I spoke. The document lay between us on the kitchen table. Simple, ordinary, yet somehow more frightening than all the letters I had read so far. Because letters contained opinions, memories, concerns. This was different. This was legal, permanent, intentional. I slowly reached for it. My fingers felt strangely cold. What exactly is this? I asked. Daniel looked at the document before answering. Richard called it his contingency plan. The phrase immediately caught my attention. Contingency plan? Daniel nodded. In case his concerns became reality. A knot formed in my stomach. I looked down at Richard's signature. There it was. Clear and unmistakable. The same signature I had seen on tax returns, anniversary cards, mortgage papers, and countless checks over 4 decades of marriage. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't a note. Richard had finalized this. Years ago, I began reading. The language was formal. Much of it sounded like legal terminology. But one section stood out immediately. A family. Trust. I blinked. Then read it again. A family trust. I looked up at Daniel. Richard created a trust? Daniel nodded. Several years before he passed away. I sat back in my chair. That made no sense. Richard and I discussed almost everything. Finances, retirement, investments, insurance. Nothing had ever been hidden between us. At least that was what I believed. Yet somehow this existed, and I had never heard about it. Why didn't he tell me? Daniel took a slow breath. He intended to. That answer sounded familiar. Too familiar. I remembered the first letter, the warnings, the concerns, the things Richard never quite managed to explain. For the first time, I wondered how many conversations had almost happened, how many truths had remained unfinished. I continued reading. The trust contained several assets, investments, savings, property interests, nothing extravagant. Richard had never been a wealthy man, but he had been careful, disciplined, patient. Over decades, those habits had accumulated into something significant, far more significant than I expected. I felt my pulse quicken. Then I reached a section that made me stop entirely. Beneficiary conditions. The words seemed harmless at first. Then I read them again. And again. My eyes widened. Daniel. My voice barely emerged. He already knew which section I had reached. Keep reading. So I did. The trust contained restrictions, requirements, specific behavioral clauses. Richard had attached conditions to inheritance. I had never heard of anything like that before. The further I read, the more unbelievable it became. One clause referred to intentional isolation. Another referred to manipulation of family relationships. Another addressed financial coercion. I stared at the page, unable to process what I was seeing. Richard hadn't simply worried. He had anticipated scenarios, detailed scenarios, specific scenarios, and somehow many of them sounded painfully familiar. I looked up. Did he really think things would become this bad? Daniel remained quiet for a moment. Then he answered, "No." The response surprised me. No. He hoped he was wrong. That hurt more than I expected, because I understood exactly what he meant. Richard hadn't prepared these documents because he wanted conflict. He prepared them because he loved his family. He hoped he would never need protection from them. But hope and preparation are not the same thing. Sometimes people prepare for storms they pray never arrive. I lowered my eyes back to the document. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Melissa. 5 years ago, we had been sitting in my living room. Out of nowhere, she asked a strange question. Have you ever considered downsizing? At the time, I laughed. No. She smiled politely. This house is awfully big for one person. I remembered the conversation clearly now, because it hadn't happened only once. It happened repeatedly. Different wording. Same topic. The house. The property. My future plans. At the time, I thought she was concerned about me. Now I wasn't so sure. The realization made my stomach turn. Daniel broke the silence. Richard noticed that too. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Without saying a word, he opened another section of the folder. Inside were handwritten notes. More observations. More dates. One page immediately drew my attention. Richard had written, Melissa asked about transferring ownership. 3rd time this year. Jason present. Margaret unaware of discussion afterward. I felt my chest tighten. Discussion afterward? What discussion? I flipped through additional pages. More references appeared. Questions about property values. Questions about investments. Questions about estate planning. Always Melissa. Often Jason. And increasingly, my name appeared less and less. As if the conversations were happening around me instead of with me. A cold feeling settled over the room. For years I believed I was part of every important family decision. Now I wasn't certain. Daniel finally leaned forward. There is something else you need to know. I looked at him. His expression had changed. The calmness was still there. But underneath it was concern. Real concern. What is it? He hesitated. Then opened the final section of the folder. Several financial statements appeared. Recent statements. Not old ones. Recent. Very recent. My heartbeat immediately accelerated. Why are these here? Daniel slid one page toward me. A highlighted transaction sat near the bottom. The date was only 2 weeks old. 2 weeks. I stared at it, then looked at him. I don't understand. His voice became very quiet. Someone has been trying to access assets connected to Richard's trust. The words hit me like ice water. I looked back at the statement, then at the highlighted name attached to the inquiry. The moment I recognized it, my blood ran cold. Because it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a bank employee. It was someone from my own family. Someone who apparently believed those assets already belonged to them. And suddenly, my forgotten birthday no longer looked like a cruel coincidence. It looked like part of a much larger plan. I barely slept during the next 3 days. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was heartbroken anymore. Something had changed. The pain was still there, but it no longer felt sharp. It felt clear, like a fog that had finally lifted. For years, I had explained away every disappointment, every exclusion, every awkward conversation, every forgotten invitation. I always found a reason, a justification, an excuse. Now I had Richard's letters, his notes, his warnings, and perhaps for the first time in my life, I was looking at my family without excuses. The house felt different too, quieter, stronger somehow. I spent those days reading everything Daniel had brought, every page, every note, every observation Richard had carefully documented. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I laughed in disbelief. Most of the time I simply sat there, remembering. The memories no longer appeared random. They formed a pattern Richard had recognized years before I did. By Sunday afternoon, Daniel had returned twice. Each visit revealed another small piece of the puzzle. Nothing explosive, nothing dramatic, just facts, dates, records, questions that deserved answers. Then Sunday evening arrived, and so did my family. I heard Jason's truck pull into the driveway just after 6. For a moment, I stood by the living room window and watched. Melissa stepped out first. Perfect hair, perfect smile, holding a bakery box, as if they were visiting an old friend. Not a woman they had abandoned on her 70th birthday. Jason followed. Then Sophie. Then Ethan. The whole family. 3 days late. 3 days too late. I opened the door before they could knock. Melissa's smile widened immediately. There she is. I said nothing. She handed me the bakery box. We brought dessert. Dessert. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because of how absurd it was. 3 days earlier I had sat alone beside a birthday cake. Now they were bringing dessert. As though that erased everything. I stepped aside. Come in. The family entered. The familiar smell of Melissa's perfume filled the hallway. The grandchildren moved toward the living room. Jason glanced around the house. Everything seemed perfectly normal to them. That hurt more than anger would have. Not one person looked uncomfortable. Not one person seemed ashamed. As if my birthday had never happened. As if those empty chairs existed only in my imagination. Melissa walked into the kitchen. Oh good, she said cheerfully. You look much better. I stared at her. Better? She nodded. You seemed upset the other day. The other day? Not my birthday. Not the dinner. Not the humiliation. Just the other day. I felt something inside me settle. A final piece clicking into place. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. Because people who accidentally hurt you apologize. People who intentionally hurt you pretend nothing happened. I smiled politely. A small smile. Nothing more. Melissa seemed relieved. As though she had expected an emotional confrontation. An argument. Tears. Instead she found calm. And calm made her comfortable. That was her mistake. Jason sat at the kitchen table. How have you been, Mom? I looked at him. Really looked at him. My son. The little boy who once cried when I left him at kindergarten. The teenager who called me whenever he had a problem. The young man I had spent decades protecting. Now he couldn't even acknowledge my birthday. I've been fine. That was all I said. He nodded, clearly satisfied. Nobody mentioned the restaurant. Nobody mentioned the photographs. Nobody mentioned the social media posts. The silence around the subject felt almost scripted, as though they had agreed beforehand. A family conspiracy built entirely from omission. Dinner remained strangely normal. Painfully normal. Melissa talked about a coworker. Jason discussed work. The grandchildren checked their phones. And through it all, nobody addressed the thing sitting in the center of the room. The truth. At one point Melissa laughed and said, "You should have come with us." The room immediately went quiet. For a second, even she looked surprised by what she'd said. I tilted my head slightly. Come where? Her smile flickered. The restaurant. I waited. She didn't continue. Jason stared at his plate. Sophie suddenly became fascinated by her phone. Nobody rescued Melissa. Nobody explained. Nobody apologized. Interesting. Very interesting. Because guilty people often reveal more than honest ones. Melissa recovered quickly. It was just a last-minute thing. I nodded. I see. Nothing more. No accusation. No anger. No tears. The conversation moved on. But I noticed something. Melissa kept watching me. Small glances. Tiny observations. Almost as if she was waiting for a reaction. Waiting for proof that I still knew nothing. That I remained exactly where she expected me to be. Blind. Confused. Easy to manage. What she didn't realize was that I had spent 3 days reading Richard's warnings. 3 days studying evidence. 3 days learning the truth. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was paying attention. Later, as everyone prepared to leave, Melissa stopped near the front door. "By the way," she said casually, "have you thought any more about the house?" There it was. The question again. The same question. The same house. The same interest. I smiled. A real smile this time. Small. Quiet. Controlled. Melissa frowned slightly. "What's so funny?" I looked directly at her. Then at Jason. Then back at her. "Nothing." A pause. "Let's just say I've been learning a lot lately." For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty crossed her face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. But I saw it. And I knew she felt it too. The balance had shifted. She just didn't know why. As Jason reached for the front door, another knock echoed through the house. 3 calm knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I already knew who it was. Daniel. But my family didn't. I opened the door. Daniel stood on the porch holding a leather folder. The moment Melissa saw him, her smile vanished. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I watched someone else become uncomfortable. Something told me this was only the beginning. The moment Daniel stepped through the front door, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, not immediately, but enough. Enough for me to notice. Enough for Melissa to notice. And most importantly, enough for Daniel to notice. Jason looked confused. Sophie glanced up from her phone. Ethan frowned slightly. Nobody knew who Daniel was. Except me. And judging by the expression that flashed across Melissa's face, perhaps except her. Just for a second. A fraction of a second. But it was there. Recognition. Then it vanished. "Mom?" Jason asked. "Who's this?" Daniel offered a polite smile. "Daniel Brooks." Nothing more. No explanation. No introduction. Just his name. I watched Melissa carefully. Her shoulders had become noticeably tense. Interesting. Very interesting. Because when innocent people meet strangers, they become curious. When guilty people meet strangers, they become nervous. I stepped aside. "Daniel, come in." He entered carrying the same leather folder. The folder Melissa couldn't stop staring at. We moved into the dining room. The same dining room where 7 empty chairs had sat just days earlier. The same room where I had blown out my birthday candles alone. Now every chair was occupied. The irony wasn't lost on me. For several minutes, conversation remained painfully ordinary. Work, school, weather, anything except the questions hanging over the table. Then Melissa spoke. "So, Daniel, how do you know Margaret?" The question sounded casual. But her eyes weren't casual. Neither was her smile. Daniel folded his hands. "I knew Richard." The effect was immediate. Silence. Even Jason looked surprised. "You knew Dad?" Daniel nodded. "We worked together for many years." I watched Jason carefully. Confusion crossed his face. Then uncertainty. Because he had never heard of Daniel. Neither had I. Which meant one important thing. Richard had kept this relationship private. Very private. Melissa leaned back in her chair. "Oh, just one word." Yet somehow it sounded disappointed. As though she had hoped for a different answer. The conversation continued. But not naturally. Everyone seemed distracted. Waiting. Watching. Measuring. At one point Ethan asked to be excused. A few minutes later Sophie followed. Soon only the adults remained at the table. Exactly as I had hoped. Jason reached for his coffee. "So what brings you into town?" Daniel looked toward me before answering. "Your father asked me to help with something." The cup stopped halfway to Jason's mouth. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. I remained silent. Daniel remained calm. And suddenly nobody seemed interested in coffee anymore. "What exactly are you helping with?" Melissa asked. There it was. The question she'd been dying to ask. Daniel smiled politely. "Family matters." Melissa laughed. Too quickly. Too loudly. The kind of laugh people use when they're uncomfortable. "That sounds mysterious." "It is." The smile disappeared from her face. I almost admired Daniel. He never raised his voice. Never became aggressive. Yet somehow every answer created more pressure. More uncertainty. More discomfort. The room felt tighter with every passing minute. Then Jason changed the subject. Or at least he tried to. "Mom, have you given any more thought to selling the house?" There it was again. The house. Always the house. Always the same destination. Different roads. Same destination. A strange calm settled over me. A week earlier the question would have hurt. Now it simply sounded predictable. I smiled. No. Jason blinked. No. No. That was all. No explanation. No apology. No discussion. For some reason my answer seemed to unsettle him. Melissa immediately stepped in. We only worry about you. Of course. That old line. The same line repeated for years. Concern disguised as control. Compassion disguised as pressure. I looked directly at her. For the first time in a very long time. Really looked at her. You've always been very interested in my future. The room went quiet. Melissa forced a smile. I care about family. I nodded slowly. I'm beginning to understand that. Again, silence. Again, discomfort. And this time nobody rushed to fill it. Daniel calmly placed the leather folder on the table. The sound was soft, barely audible, yet every head immediately turned toward it, especially Melissa's. Her eyes locked onto the folder, then onto Daniel, then onto me. I could almost see the calculations happening inside her head. Questions, possibilities, risks. For years, she had been the person controlling information. Now she was the one being kept in the dark. And she hated it. Daniel opened the folder. Not completely. Just enough. A few documents became visible. Nothing more. Jason frowned. What is that? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed a single page. Then another. Then another. Carefully arranging them on the table. My heart began beating faster. I already knew what they were. Richard's records. His notes. His evidence. Years of observations. Years of warnings. Years of preparation. Melissa suddenly looked pale. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough that even Jason noticed. You okay? She nodded too quickly. Of course. But her voice sounded different now. Less confident. Less certain. Daniel finally looked at Jason. Then at Melissa. Then back down at the documents. What exactly is this? Jason asked again. This time Daniel answered. Your father's final instructions. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. I watched Jason's expression shift from confusion to concern, then concern to alarm. Melissa's face had become completely unreadable, which somehow frightened me more. Because for the first time since all this began, she wasn't pretending. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't controlling the conversation. She was waiting to hear something she clearly feared. Then Daniel slid the first document toward the center of the table and quietly said the words that changed everything. I think it's time we discuss what Richard wanted to happen after his death. At that moment, I realized the real confrontation hadn't started yet. It was just about to begin. The room was completely silent. Nobody touched the documents. Nobody reached for their coffee. Nobody even looked at me. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the papers Daniel had placed on the table. For the first time all evening, Melissa looked genuinely afraid. Not nervous. Not uncomfortable. Afraid. Daniel adjusted the first document and looked toward Jason. Your father established a family trust several years before his death. Jason frowned. A trust. Daniel nodded. One with very specific conditions. The confusion on Jason's face quickly turned into curiosity. Then anticipation. I recognized that look. It was the look of someone expecting good news. The look of someone who believed they already knew the outcome. Melissa sat perfectly still. Her hands folded tightly together. Too tightly. Daniel continued. Richard's primary concern was Margaret's well-being. I felt a lump form in my throat. Even after all these years, Richard was still protecting me. Still standing beside me. Still fighting for me. Just in a different way. Daniel opened another document. The trust contains behavioral provisions. Jason blinked. Behavioral provisions? Daniel nodded. Conditions tied to inheritance eligibility. The room grew quiet again. I watched confusion spread across Jason's face. Clearly, he had never heard of such a thing. Neither had I. Daniel continued reading. Any beneficiary found to have intentionally isolated, manipulated, financially pressured, or emotionally exploited Margaret Wilson would immediately lose all rights to distributions from the trust. The words settled over the room. Heavy, unavoidable, permanent. Nobody spoke. Then Jason laughed nervously. A short laugh. An uncomfortable one. Okay, but what does that have to do with us? Daniel slowly turned another page. Then another. and another. Each page contained Richard's notes, dates, events, observations, years of records, years of evidence. The color slowly drained from Melissa's face. I saw it happen, one page at a time, one memory at a time, one documented incident after another. Christmas, Thanksgiving, family vacations, birthday parties, gatherings, invitations, every exclusion, every manipulation, every excuse. Recorded, preserved, verified. Richard had documented everything. Jason's smile disappeared. What is all this? Daniel's voice remained calm. Evidence. One word. Nothing more. Yet it changed everything. Jason looked toward Melissa. Melissa looked toward the table. Neither seemed eager to speak. For years they had controlled the narrative. Now the narrative existed in black and white, and it wasn't written by them. Daniel carefully pushed the final document forward. This is Richard's final determination. The room felt smaller. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. Even though I already knew what was coming. Even though Daniel had explained it days earlier. Hearing it now felt different. Because now they were hearing it too. Daniel read aloud. Based upon documented patterns of intentional exclusion and demonstrated attempts to influence family assets through manipulation, Jason Wilson and Melissa Wilson are disqualified as beneficiaries under the terms of the trust. Silence. Absolute silence. Jason stared at Daniel, then at the document, then at me. His face had gone pale. No. The word came out as a whisper. No. Melissa finally spoke. There has to be some mistake. Daniel calmly shook his head. There isn't. The panic in her eyes became impossible to hide. Years of confidence. Years of control. Years of certainty. Gone. In seconds. Jason stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down he knew. They both knew. The evidence wasn't invented. The events had happened. The birthday happened. The exclusions happened. The manipulation happened. The only difference was that someone had been paying attention. Richard. Jason turned toward me. For a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not anger. Not arrogance. Desperation. Mom. The word cracked slightly. Mom, please. I looked at him quietly, waiting, hoping perhaps I would finally hear the apology I had wanted for so many years. Instead, he glanced at the documents, then back at me, and suddenly, I understood. He wasn't mourning our relationship. He was mourning what he had lost. The trust, the money, the future he thought was guaranteed. A strange sadness settled over me. Not because of the trust, not because of the money, because in that moment I realized Richard had been right. Years ago, all along. Jason stepped closer. We can fix this. I looked into my son's eyes. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my heart since my birthday. Fix what? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no answer. Not really. Finally I spoke. Quietly, calmly, the way Richard always did. You remembered I was your mother only after the money disappeared. Nobody replied. Because nobody could. A few minutes later they left. One by one. Without another argument. Without another excuse. The front door closed. And for the first time in days, the house felt peaceful. Not empty. Peaceful. A week later, something unexpected happened. A few neighbors stopped by. Friends from church. An old coworker. Even Daniel. Someone brought flowers. Someone brought pie. Someone brought coffee. Nothing extravagant. Nothing expensive. Just kindness. Simple kindness. We sat around the same dining room table. The table where I had once stared at 7 empty chairs. Only this time, the chairs weren't empty. The room was filled with conversation, laughter, warmth, connection. And as I looked around the table, I finally understood something. Family isn't defined by who shares your blood. Family is defined by who shows up, who stays, who chooses you. When the afternoon ended, I carried a slice of birthday cake onto the porch. The same cake I had frozen after my birthday. The sun was setting. The sky glowed orange across the neighborhood. For a moment, I imagined Richard sitting beside me, smiling, watching, proud. And somehow I knew exactly what he would say. You are not alone. I smiled, then looked out across the fading light. The people who shared my blood had abandoned me, but the stranger who knocked on my door reminded me of something far more important. Sometimes the people who become your family are the ones who choose to stand beside you when everyone else walks away. And that, at 70 years old, became the greatest birthday gift I had ever received.